Gretchen Daily is the Bean Professor of Environmental Science at Stanford. Her work focuses on understanding the dependence and impacts of people on nature and the deep societal transformation needed for both people and nature to thrive. To integrate the values of nature into policy, finance, and practice. So Gretchen co-founded the famous Natural Capital Project. It's a global effort of which the Chinese Academy of Sciences is also a core member. So Gretchen has published several hundred scientific and popular articles and a dozen books, including Green Growth That Works, Natural Capital Policy and Finance Mechanism from around the world, and Rural Livelihood and Environmental Sustainability in China. I think I have also seen a Chinese translation of the book in our Beijing forum. Gretchen is a fellow of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and he received international honors for her work. So without further ado, Gretchen, it's all yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Congratulations on getting the sky up. I'm so elated with the opportunity that this opens up for our community to interact much more intensively on the critical issues before us that are both intellectually really engaging and challenging, and also I would say just sort of emotionally and almost at a philosophical level deeply profound, that we stand really on a precipice today, and I'm sure we could describe that in different dimensions. As a biologist by training, I have had a long time focus on both climate change and on destruction of the web of life, relating both of those to human development and trying to find and open pathways to sustainable and inclusive growth. And going to dive in today into an arena that where China really stands out as a tremendous leader, having tasted some of the worst extremes of disaster in the world and having committed to now a dramatic shift, going beyond lots of small-scale demonstrations of how we could integrate environmental protection, say, and human development to drive actually a very large-scale and system-wide transformation. So it's beyond these little demonstrations to transformation in China, and hopefully globally, we're also interconnected. So what I'd like to do is follow this econ style for sure. I welcome interruptions at any moment. But to give you a kind of sketch of where I wanted to go, I'll just say I was going to open up with kind of a view as to what's happening worldwide, and then situate the advances being made in China in the science, in economics, in policy, in an integrated approach that's beyond even those arenas, because it's really helpful, I think, to see the broader objectives and the role that China is playing in driving this suite of efforts. So that's where I'll be heading, and given our limited time, I thought I'd give more of a framework and overview, and then I hope this is really a beginning of a conversation into which we can dive a lot more deeply and empirically down different paths. So as you guys all know, China has put forth this vision, sometimes referenced as China's dream, for an ecological civilization. So a lot of this work, I want to situate it, actually, much of it here at Stanford, thanks to our dear friend Ken Arrow, and to many others who are continuing to play leading roles in, firstly, integrating. So Ken playing a really lead role in bringing people together, along with Hal Mooney, who set up, he's in biology, the equivalent of the IPCC for biodiversity and ecosystem services called IPBES. Paul Ehrlich, who's played a key role together with all of us in building this foundation. Partha Dasgupta, who visited Stanford, I think back around 1989, 1990, and who today launched the follow-on to the Stern Review on climate change, which is literally on the economics of biodiversity. So that was launched this morning at 6 a.m. and is really worth looking up if you're not already involved in it. And then finally, I want to mention here, among the kind of this, some of this constellation of people, Alvaro Umana, who got his PhD and master's at Stanford, partly in econ, partly in hydrology, and all have played key roles in the policy arenas and have been key mentors to us. And I then am smiling here and thinking especially about Larry Goulder, with whom I've had the pleasure to work for a long time and who's been deeply engaged in all of these efforts. So here, just to indicate a little bit of what the movement is like worldwide, we can see an image of Costa Rica, which actually was the poster child of planetary destruction up into the mid and even late 1990s. They had the highest deforestation rate at the national scale ever recorded. And it wasn't clear what could possibly be done to turn this around. And yet, since then, with Alvaro Umana's leadership, there's been the invention of payments for ecosystem benefits or ecosystem services, such as carbon sequestration being carried on by the mountains in the background and all that tropical forest that blankets them, provision of water supply for drinking, irrigation, and also hydropower, which is one of the biggest exports from Costa Rica to neighboring countries and accounts for much of the electricity, the vast majority in Costa Rica itself. And that all depends on forest as well for soaking up the water that comes in torrential rains over part of the year, just like in China, and needs to be stored throughout the year. Also, a key role in controlling sedimentation. And all of this, plus biodiversity, plus the part of the economy, usually the largest part, ecotourism, that hinges on nature. So this payment system that Costa Rica instituted has been replicated now in many parts of the world. And going from there to another example at the city scale, New York, if they're not familiar with it, I'll just give you a tiny taste. It's basically 10 million people living in the city, experiencing declines in water quality through the 1990s, and a high risk of Giardia or Cryptosporidium and other pathogens affecting this public water supply. So the city, after some period of negotiation and a lot of new science, making a deal with upstream farmers, ranchers, foresters, such as this dairy farmer here, to invest in watershed protection and in managing of activities such as putting the cows in these solar heated tents that the city pays for at about $50,000 each, that keeps their health much better. And we all know, especially now with the pandemic, how intimately connected human and animal and sort of health is broadly. So this has been also a tremendous success and is another example that has been replicated in many places around the world. So about 55 major cities in Latin America, including most of the capital cities, now have this kind of scheme up and running. This also includes many cities in China, including Beijing. Then I'd say about 10 years later, with a lot of innovation, both in the empirical science arena, as well as in kind of the financial and policy mechanisms that would allow for pursuing both investments in natural capital, providing these vital life support services, and at the same time, incentivizing those and aligning them with livelihoods. There was, a moment when we set up, this was hard putting this guy up back then, the Natural Capital Project. And the idea was to systematize these approaches, develop a universal sort of framework and language for thinking about the values of nature and ways of incorporating them into policy, finance, planning, and practice in many different sectors and all across the world. So that's what I'd like to dive into now. We set this up, it's been an evolution, but today the core research partners are the Chinese Academy of Sciences and the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, together with the Stockholm Resilience Center, with the hub here at Stanford, and another major research contribution coming from the University of Minnesota. And then core implementing partners, initially represented by these two NGOs, WWF and TNC, now represented more and more by the world's major multilateral development banks. So Inter-American, Asian, and the World Bank are the main ones that we're working with, but many other implementing partners worldwide. So that's just to say that there's a large community advancing these approaches that involve developing the science that shows, for example, where to draw the lines, where and how much nature to protect, and to track all of that with new data streams coming in on the condition and functioning of our life support systems across the biosphere, integrating that in all the data flows and the science into tools that are readily accessible and actionable by decision makers to then focus in the most efficient possible way for highest possible kind of return on investment, stewardship, investments in natural capital and in kind of new pathways of human development. So that's the game plan. The structure is something like this, with a lot of investment in just basic research, that understanding of the whole complex system that we're operating with, doing a lot on the right, sort of co-developing the understanding basically in demonstrations, many of them in China and in other parts of the world, to then produce tools that would enable decision makers at many different levels, from communities up to heads of government or corporations, to shift the way we basically integrate values of nature into decision making. And all of this is hosted on a platform that's based here. So the way it works is, from the beginning, we've really oriented around an economic approach and economic frameworks for decision making, wanting to make advances that have a very compelling economic or business case. And so the idea is just to look at these production functions of ecosystems, basically the goods and services that are produced together with people, obviously, and some human capital and other investments by people. But it's looking at, basically our choices. Let's take an example, alternative management or policy relevant to agriculture and making agriculture much more green and sustainable globally. Then looking at what the effect of a given policy option might be on ecosystem, say, condition or structure, such as shown here, the amount and distribution of natural vegetation along stream sides embedded in farming systems. Then looking at what the implications are for ecosystem function, here specifically water filtration and retention that are crucial for both, and the services, it's actually a wide array of services. Obviously water quality, so how much sediment or farm runoff, nitrogen and phosphorus is in the streams, and also agricultural yield, retaining that water is crucial to plant growth and yield. And all of that is key to human health and obviously to just kind of the economics of farming systems. So that's basically how all of the science through to demonstrations is framed. And there's a huge amount, most of my research is more on the biophysical realm here. And then thanks to Larry teaching me a lot, and he's certainly excused for many mistakes I make in here, but and working with many other economists, trying to put this very much in an economics framework. So we've now integrated science from many different fields. So over the past 10 years or so, developing an integrated framework, making a lot of research advances in different fields to be able to, in an integrated way, map out and evaluate the impact of different sort of policy options or use of new financial mechanisms to achieve these sort of win-win benefits. And a lot of the work initially was at more landscape or large seascape scales. But more recently, if you look in the bottom left corner, we've been developing all of this for cities. So with the data streams coming in at very fine scales, even meter by meter, we can map out investments in cities, little green spaces and things, and quantify, for example, their benefits in the way of urban cooling. Or if you look at the bottom right in health, we've also done a lot of work, partly here at Stanford with people in psychology and in medicine, and partly internationally on both physical and mental health. And the role, for example, just to give you a taste of this, of green space, like that little city park, in promoting physical activity and a huge array of physical health benefits. And obviously physical and mental health are highly symbiotic, but we've also looked at the benefits of nature experience, especially among urban populations, of even just small doses of nature in urban parks on cognitive functioning and emotional well-being. And there's just tremendous evidence now that, firstly, urban populations live compared to their rural counterparts under much more stress and higher burdens of mental illness in the way of depression primarily. And there now is a lot of evidence that this is causally linked to, us first of all being on Zoom all day and attached ever more to electronic devices, kids as well, obviously, and painfully to think about. But it's also just a lack of time and getting out and access to nature. So there's a huge, yeah, please.
I have like a quick question. So do you consider those like in China for the important thing is factories, industry production, right? And another thing I'm curious about, can you incorporate like something also, I don't know if it's natural or not, virus, COVID-19, how is this related to this, the nature?
Yeah, so you're asking two big questions. On the first one on factories, are you thinking about basically the concentration and distribution of industrial zones in China, that kind of thing, or just
right?
You just mean across sectors? How do we look at?
Yeah. I mean, it's
this approach.
Yeah, I mean, it contributes to income, right? The income level, but at the same time, it lose the nature, right? So.
Right. So the way we that's absolutely central here, and what we are doing is sector by sector, looking at where our production activities are, what their dependence is, and also what their impacts are on natural capital. So in hydropower, for example, we look at where all the facilities are, how much they depend on upstream ecosystem conditions for of the clean and reliable year-round water supply, and how to change, let's say, talking about factory production to help ensure that. So sometimes the location of factories, was situated right near hydropower in a way that then actually harms the hydropower production. So looking at all those kinds of synergistic or antagonistic effects. And then to touch on COVID-19, yeah, absolutely. Basically throughout human history, there have been a lot of major pandemics, and this is just the most recent. There are highly likely to be many, many more. If from a pathogen's point of view, and biologically, 40% of all the world's species are pathogens. So there's no way we're going to escape pathogens. And from a pathogen's point of view, humanity is in many ways the best target and the jackpot. If you can infect humanity and make your living off of people, we're the greatest resource in that kind of framing. And so the more we get into, it's a wide array of things. It's our population numbers, it's our relative immune suppression in many parts of the world where there's insufficient sort of food security and dietary health. It's also, to a great degree, contact of people with wildlife and it's typically more impoverished people, or a lot of these pandemics have actually come out of the US and other regions, and it's sometimes through farming systems, but it's often through food systems. And protecting nature more and separating food systems, especially in any animal products, not in pollination and other things, but in animal products, is absolutely essential to reducing the risk of spread of pathogens. And that's another part of actually the health arena here. We're looking most intensely now at the spread of vector-borne diseases like mosquito-borne malaria and the schistosomiasis and all sorts of mainly vector-borne diseases, and how those are likely to change with changes in the distribution of natural ecosystems and ecosystems in general, and with climate change. So that's all a really key part of this. And I'll give you some examples now that will help bring the specifics to life, indicating that this is now being used in about 100, most countries. After 185, you get to the Vatican and other really small countries. And the first dozen cities, many of which are in China, let's say 5 key cities in China that I'll show you in a minute. And all of this is being co-developed. So through deep engagement with the international research community and community of practitioners in government and NGOs and development banks and so on. And then often at the country level, and here with many provincial DRCs in China, just working to ensure that we're tuning the science and putting it into the platform in a way that's most useful for answering key policy and especially kind of economic development and planning questions. So all of this is being co-developed. Now this empirical work has been embedded in a modeling system that I'm not going to get into, but I'm happy to share any of these papers and talk about it in depth later, but globally. And this is being used by this new IPCC, IPBES, for biodiversity and ecosystem services that just issued its first report in 2019. So all of this is new and coming online in about 25 years, after climate came online. But the point of it is that we can hear, if you look at the 3 services at the top, water quality regulation by ecosystems, coastal climate risk reduction, given projected sea level rise and intensification of hurricanes and other storms, and then crop pollination with 2/3 or 3/4 of the world's crops quite pollinator dependent, and yet we're seeing collapse of pollinators worldwide. And what this modeling lets us do at a very fine scale is look at how much benefit ecosystems can supply, how many people need that benefit, kind of in the second row, and then given the overlap in that, so we're not really looking at, places where no one lives or where there's little contribution that nature can make to particular key aspects of well-being. Looking at the overlap, you can see, how much benefit can be made, and where in the world, in the bottom row, you can have the highest kind of return on investment in nature-based approaches to achieving these different benefits. And then using this system, we've been trying to scale and mainstream, and this is where I really then want to get into China. A lot of the work has been focused in Latin America and in other places, but let me dive in here into China. As I imagine you all know, China has recently added a 5th pillar to the Constitution, an ecological pillar, and the 3 core questions being at the forefront of, let's say, the work involving a lot of people on the science side. So I'd love to hear more on the economics and other policy areas. Are these questions: where and how much do we protect? How can we secure nature and livelihoods at the same time? And how can we best sort of guide and track ecological dimensions of performance? And it's also more broad than that. We want to become ever more integrated, but especially looking initially at ecological performance. So just to show then quickly how these 3 questions are being addressed so far, and to get your feedback, I'll dive in and say there are these main efforts, these elements, and ecosystem assessment that I'll jump into now, land zoning, which has always gone on in China, but now is really geared around this, an ecological development strategy, and this new metric called gross ecosystem product that was pioneered and has been advanced by China and is now being considered for adoption much more widely and internationally. So on the first question, China led by far and away the most sophisticated ecosystem assessment of any country. A few other countries have done this. The US hasn't really done it. And so with incredible input of data from satellites and other sensing systems across the country, with a lot of ground truthing and over 141 ground survey sites that are being set up permanently in a system to monitor change, and then modeling this through that INVEST software, what we have is now emerging a system of natural capital accounts that quantifies the stock of the natural capital, and here shown just at the very highest level, kind of the extent and distribution of all these different ecosystem types, but it's down into micro detail that I would be happy as a biologist to get into. And then quantification of services, and this just shows using INVEST quantification of some of the key services. And with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, a lot of this has been tuned and really refined and improved in China. So our sandstorm model, for example, is really created in China. A lot of the hydrologic services, water retention on the bottom left for hydropower production, irrigation, drinking water supply, and industrial use. A lot of that was calibrated and improved working in China, and same with flood control, whether by forests or by wetlands, shown in the bottom middle there. And the upshot of this assessment was that it was done over the years 2000 to 2010 initially. Now it's ongoing every 5 years, lined up with the 5-year planning. The bottom line was that all of these services had improved thanks to major investments such as the sloping land conversion program in conserving and restoring forests and grasslands. But biodiversity conservation is still really in a deep dive in China and globally. So based on the importance of these different services, their distribution, yeah.
I have a question about the grassland slope conservation project, grain for green and that type of thing. So first of all, I just heard you say you think that it's been sort of successful. I'd like to hear the overall approach to that. I know that it was very controversial at first, but then they supported this for 16 years, but then Xi Jinping stopped it, the payments to the farmers. It was very popular. Why did he stop it? And then do they think that, I guess my real point is, do they think that it's payment for services is really the key to make that doing it, that they paid for this and so it was realized? And then I don't know if you're able to talk about this. We've been trying and working in rural education and rural health and early childhood education to convince the government to pay for services that are socially beneficial, like paying families to put their kids into parental training, or pay their families to keep their kids in school, that kind of thing. Oh my God, you can't. That the Ministry of Education won't even think about conditional cash transfers like they've done here. So I don't know if that's too big of a question.
Okay.
You can answer it. So I'm very interested in this.
Okay, I would love to follow up on this. So I can say first off that there's been quite a bit of look at the effectiveness of those payments from biophysical perspectives, and uniformly the result of those investigations, I think, is very favorable. That just like in Costa Rica, they're not perfect and nothing's perfectly efficient and all that. It depends what your criteria are for evaluating their effectiveness. But both Costa Rica and China, who've gone farther than any other country, they couldn't be more different in a lot of respects, but they're both very influential. The perceived benefits of this type of approach has led to real proliferation worldwide. There was a paper in Nature, I think, so it's led by Jim Salzman, a legal scholar now at UCSB and UCLA, and I'd be happy to share that. It came out in Nature Sustainability, and it reviews all these payment systems worldwide, and it's I think about $50 billion going into them annually. I'm not remembering specifically, but and much of the evidence for their success comes from China. That's on the biophysical side. On the more social side, working with Li Shuzhou, as you know, and others at Xi'an Jiaotong University, we've been interviewing people at the household level to understand what enables participation and voluntary participation, and what enables success, kind of those two things in implementation and outcome. And that's more complex. And in some cases, you can have negative effects on people's household well-being by restricting use of land and requiring this kind of thing. But they've been tuning the policies a lot over the years based on this work. And Xi Jinping was threatening to cancel the whole thing. And then I thought they got a second phase. I know they got a second phase recently. And it's changed a little bit, but my impression, and here's where we need to sync up, but is that this has been a major driver of actually expansion of these programs. And it would be fabulous to explore bringing in, maybe through this other pathway then, Scott, educational and other types of investment, because everybody's realizing more and more how tightly interlinked everything is. So in this science paper noted here, we present the analysis, and there's a huge supplementary information thing on how it was the sloping land conversion program or grade to green program, looking at the county level, that really explains a lot of the improvements seen. So let me keep on from there, but I'd love to follow up on that opportunity. And as I keep on, you'll see there's more and more investment in this type of approach at every level. So the government then expanded its zoning. Over the many years as we've been doing this work, it kept building up. It started out at about 15% zoned for natural capital. It went up to about 28% 10 years ago. And then in this recent period, it's 49% is zoned for natural capital. And we've run many demonstrations around Beijing. That this is what I'd be happy to share as well. So looking at water supply to Beijing, part of it, about half comes from, the area around Hebei, feeding into Mirin Reservoir. And there's been another payment program, that paddy land to dry land conversion program, where farmers we've interviewed with Li Shuzhou's group, they all say, hell no, we're not going to continue this unless we're paid every year. So there is ongoing payment to help firstly convert the land so that you have cleaner and more abundant water available. So convert it from paddy land irrigated rice, which is only relatively recently planted there, back to dry land farming. But the major part of this investment is just to diversify incomes, diversify the economy, and train people to make other livelihoods. And that's seen as a huge success. A lot of the water now comes from the center part of the country is through this whole south to north water transfer program. We've also analyzed that deeply, and the move of over 2 million people from mountainous areas at the headwaters of the middle fork of the south to north water transfer program. And all of this analysis is informing where people move, where the investments are made in social kinds of benefits that you're addressing, Scott, and in ensuring that the water actually is more secure in its delivery by reducing human impacts on all the ecosystem contributions to water security. And then a third area where we've done a lot of demonstration work is in Hainan Island, where biodiversity it's one of the places where it's in steep decline. And it's globally kind of a hot spot for biodiversity. And there we've shown that rubber farming, which is one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss, and tropical forest clearing, not only in China, but many other places, and is emblematic of just what's going on in the Amazon everywhere with respect to clearing tropical forest to open farming, commodity production. We've shown that you can have a win-win, and there are these diversified rubber production systems that actually yield better ecosystem services and also much better income for farmers. So we're trying to expand that kind of approach across other production practices in China. So that's, and then aside from that, there's been...
I have one more question.
Yeah, please,
Back up to the previous one. So basically this was the forced migration from villages that are at the upper headlands of these watersheds, right? And have you seen empirical analysis of the impact on, you say that they've helped, and I totally agree that they must help the purity of water, right? If you stop farming in those upper areas and stop putting on pesticides, et cetera, it's going to and probably protect soil runoff. But what's happened to those families in terms of their, I guess, wealth, education, and income? Have you seen the impacts on the families, and what's the input into that from the policy side?
Okay, so that's a really key question and set of questions. The people leading that work are it's through Li Shuzhuo's group at Xi'an University that I know. And two of the lead people project-wise are Li Feng and Li Jie. And we have, Li Feng is lead author of a couple of papers. One came out in PNAS, I think in 2016, which was about halfway through implementation of that effort. And the other came out maybe a year or two later in Ambio, and I'd be happy to follow up and share those. And I'm sure there's more recent work, and I've been a little out of touch because of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. But the upshot initially was, first of all, that, there's the presentation of the program as a voluntary program. So they're looking at Li Feng and the whole team, firstly, who's actually opting to move first or who is moving first. And it's wealthier people. So they've done interviews, household interviews of a couple thousand people, I think, and they're trying to track them and looking at what their starting sort of asset levels are, looking at a wide, financial, like their land, and then kind of social capital, human capital, and then how that changes in the resettlement areas. And they're trying to inform the the social kinds of services provided in the resettlement communities to ensure that people are given a decent chance to integrate into the more new local livelihoods. They've all been moved relatively locally, having learned painful lessons from Three Gorges. They're not being moved far away. It's relatively locally. I think a lot of people are still going back because it's local enough. So I don't know how much the land actually is revegetating and things like that. And it takes a little while for a biophysical, or the social signal really to be confidently seen. So I'd say there's a lot still being investigated there, but if that PNAS paper, well, both of them really get into kind of the social dimensions of the policy and kind of all the worries and how to address them. But I don't know the very latest, having been out of touch over the past roughly, some months.
So just a final follow-up is, and it's so the investment is we provide social services, better social services in these new resettlement communities. Do they get subsidies for the housing? Or
they built new housing. Yeah, there's a lot of infrastructure investment in housing and in training for new livelihood activities, for access to health and medical care, for I think at least a lot of talk about this. I don't know how well it's actually manifesting itself, but and then building sort of the social connectedness and other dimensions of social capital in these new resettlement communities. And people are being moved as groups. So they're not being kind of dispersed and disconnected, but as community groups. But this would be another maybe policy context in which to, I don't know how much resettlement is a part of all of this, whether that's a high priority focus for trying to integrate all that you're doing into this suite of policy innovations and advances. And I think it is actually a key moment, and I'll follow up with you on how the eco-civilization suite of policies, I was here mainly focusing on the ones where I have a bit of expertise, but there's a suite of social policies quite related to this. So let's follow up there. Thank you.
You keep going.
Okay, I'll just kind of touch on a couple other things that will be topics for further conversation. And one is just across the country to address the loss in biodiversity. Here too, it's hard to say, this is all just starting. These commitments are just now being made. Although the analysis we did and published, a few years ago to secure biodiversity and what's being proposed with China leading this next conference of the parties to the Biodiversity Convention that the US still has not ratified, similar to climate and many other conventions. But the upshot is they're very detailed plans, kind of shown here for each of the major river basins and many different kinds of investments to secure biodiversity, and this idea of 30 by 30 that many countries are considering, 30% of land protected in some way by 2030. China's really at the forefront in at least advancing plans. And what it means is that, anywhere you go now, everything, this is like an easy case here in part of Yunnan, but every square meter is accounted for in one of these land use zones, the villages, the farmland, industrial land, and then the 49% being for ecosystem services. So then on livelihoods, it's all a matter of this eco-compensation. That's been the major approach, and more they want to make it a matter of private finance and profitable, sustainable enterprise, whether in agriculture or in all of the other sectors. So it started out as very much a publicly funded effort. And right now about 200 million people are being paid at one level or another through sloping land conversion program-like programs, but there are a whole bunch of others to restore natural capital as part of their activities. And this image on the left is from work with Li Cong and others in Lijie on interviewing people to see how it's actually going and ensure that the policies are achieving their social objectives as well as the biophysical ones.
Hey, Gretchen.
Yeah, please, Larry.
Yeah, on this question of livelihoods, are you thinking of, let's say, in order to maintain the livelihood or protect people, are you thinking mainly of financial compensation, or would it also have to do with the issue that Scott raised about resettlement and how to give people appropriate or useful options in terms of resettling? Does it include that?
Yeah, it absolutely does. It on the left, for example, one of the big challenges is loss of kind of vegetation cover that greatly elevates flood risk and reduces water security, because the water in the monsoon season kind of flashes off the land and can be very destructive. And then there's way less water being held to be meted out over the 12 months when you need irrigation, drinking, and hydropower sources of water. So just with that little example, there's a lot of investment in fuel switching. And it's amazing how many papers there are on the difficulty involved in fuel switching, but you can see kind of behind the two people here, the woman lives in the house back there and the gentleman is on a team surveying all these people. She relies on wood cut right around her house. And the idea is to provide, other forms of energy for cooking and other purposes. And not only that, to provide better access to markets. And so there's a lot of investment in transforming just livelihood activities and such at the household level, and then kind of at the county and somewhat larger scale.
I was also interested, though, in whether beyond payment to help compensate for the costs or adjustments to fuel switching, whether part of what you're doing is helping assure easier resettlement in the cases where there has to be a move?
Okay. Yeah, so that's been an enormous focus of a lot of work with people on a team with backgrounds in health, and a lot of it is mental health, actually, and interviewing people about how secure they feel socially after they've moved and who they can depend on. A lot of looking at if there's things like if there's a sudden need for cash in the family, you know, who can you go to? So mapping out social networks of the communities, you know, what is your social network? And or looking at people's connection to livelihood activities outside of the community and offering education. So really trying to understand in quite a few different domains, physical and mental health, education of both of kids and of adults, and then just kind of needs generally at the household level. And sorry, I'm not remembering really specifically the variety of categories into which some of the research has delved, but that's certainly the intention, and that's in the couple of papers I could follow up with and dive into more deeply.
Gretchen, so Tom has a question. Tom, you want
Great, Tom.
Thank you very much for the presentation. The question is whether it's similar to Scott's, I think, whether or not the Chinese government has developed and attempted to measure what happens with any one of these programs over time and place to place. Does the same amount of money per capita elicit the same kind of response? As incomes go up from other sources, does the payment have less impact? And second one is, if they have measured it, how do they assess the reasons for the difference?
That's an area where, from my somewhat limited point of view, as coming from my ecology background and working mostly with natural scientists, I would say there's tremendous need for more. I know the sloping land conversion program has been studied very extensively, but there are now many more programs being launched. And as far as I can tell, a lot of them are being driven more on the biophysical side of things, the natural sciences from that perspective. And there's not nearly enough evaluation of what's going on. So a lot of it is anecdotal, and there certainly is tremendous variation in participation levels and in outcomes after some years of receiving payments. And up until now, the people I know who are driving the policy focused on kind of the production of ecosystem services, that side, they've been saying, yeah, it's inefficient, and we all recognize that, but it's part of the big push to end, you know, extreme poverty. And if there's slop in the system, it's okay. Let's just use this window of political opportunity and momentum to restructure the government. There was huge restructuring around the, you know, adding this ecological pillar and get some accountability in there and independent kind of review of how certain agencies are performing, which hadn't been much the case before. So it's in people's minds, but as far as I know, and again, I would want to be checking with others, this is not a major part of it, and it really ought to be. And let me go down to, if you don't mind, I'm going to skip ahead. Okay, great. So the idea is they're developing a parallel metric to go alongside gross domestic product. It's called gross ecosystem product. And in short, just like the economy has countless sort of goods and services, what we're trying to do is make sense of what natural capital has, and that is also sort of, it provides a huge array of goods and services. And so in a very carefully so far designed framework on the ecological side, and this is where we could use a lot more input on other dimensions, but working together with some economists, we've set up a way of tracking the sum value of all the goods and services produced by ecosystems, with some overlap, like in agriculture, forestry, and tourism, with GDP that you can separate out and track, obviously. And then in the GEP, the purely more natural ecosystem dimensions, a lot of the work has been well developed, but there's also a lot that I'd say is complex and where research is just kind of taking off, like in health.
A quick question. So for economists, GDP is the flow of goods and services produced. And
so we're also measuring flow. Right. So we're measuring the stock, and then using invest, we estimate the flow based on the stock in a given place at a given moment, and the flow over a year, say. And using this, and this is just taking off over the past year, it's been incredible to see. And again, I've been way less in touch with the pandemic, but there's three primary aims. And this gets to, Scott, your question on financial compensation policies. The three aims are firstly to reveal the contribution of ecosystems to the economy and to society, and make that very visible. So there are all these apps that you can have on your phone. The city of Shenzhen is going all out in developing it first, but various cities are kind of in competition with one another to develop the best ways of kind of communicating this and feeding data into it. Then there's a lot of financial compensation being geared up across regions, and I'll show you how in a second. And then finally, the idea is it will be used to evaluate performance of policies themselves and also the leaders meant to implement them. And I'll just show you the case of Qinghai. This is the one case that we've done that's published in,
If I may, I just want two quick comments. Gretchen, you never shy away from dealing with incredibly hard problems, and what makes GEP especially hard is that in contrast with GDP, you can't use market prices to determine the values of these elements. I just wanted to applaud you for going after that. There are ways of trying to infer the values, but it's much harder in the GEP case than in the GDP case, because you don't have markets in many cases. And the second point is related to Hong Bin's question about stocks versus flows. And again, I want to pat you on the back, which is that there is kind of an adjacent approach to dealing with sustainability by looking at changes in stocks and of natural capital, of human capital, social capital. And Gretchen and I and others have done some work where we try to assess sustainability by seeing whether enough stocks are being left today to provide sustainable well-being for future generations. So there is kind of this complementary stock-oriented approach, which is a nice complement to what Gretchen and others are doing in the flow approach under GEP.
I really appreciate you saying that. And Larry, all of the foundation that you really laid there is integrated into this, I would say. This is something I'd love to collaborate on here. And so in that whole accounting, there is a lot of focus on change in stocks. And then GEP is just this one sort of new thing coming in to look at change in flow and to help achieve those three goals, to reveal how things are going more clearly. And it's partly that a lot of the policymakers really want one number. So it's really frustrating as an ecologist. I like having a dashboard. I'm not comfortable. I feel one number kind of hides more than it reveals. But anyway, it's to get to one number. And then also really, though, to inform financial compensation. So here for Qinghai, the water tower of Asia, the headwaters of these three great rivers and yet a relatively poor province. The idea was to explore explore GEP looking at Qinghai. And I'm going to give you two sets of results. And I apologize, they're not very visible. I want to give you just basically the idea. And then I'd love to pick up on this if there's any interest much more deeply together. And by the way, so we do use market prices where they're available. And then we use all these other ways of valuing natural capital where market prices are not available. And often kind of like, yeah, we could get into it. But here, I don't know how big your screens are, but here's looking at Qinghai itself, looking at, you know, the counties in Qinghai and the production of crops, of forestry, of, you know, fish and other things, including some services locally like water purification. But the main idea here was to look at the contribution of Qinghai to the rest of China. And that's what this set of results does. So here we're looking at, you know, beneficiaries outside of Qinghai of water supply that originates in and hinges on the natural capital in Qinghai. And then we look at flood mitigation. So what we're doing is looking at which people and where and how many people, you know, are benefiting from or suffering from if Qinghai is being ever more degraded. And it was because of overgrazing and climate change, experiencing degradation, you know, but who's benefiting? Soil retention, water purification, sandstorm prevention, and then ecotourism. So the idea in all of it is to, and that was just like a first step, but there are a lot of countries actually to go back to the global scene, embedding natural capital accounting, partly through the UN, partly through the World Bank WAVES program and the UN SCCEI program. And all of this is being reviewed now. And it's really a key moment. I think these 4 years that we've got ahead are crucial in many respects. And the Global Environment Facility next week is starting to hold advisory meetings on where to focus. And I think this kind of approach is going to be a big focus of a lot of the investments by development banks. And these payment mechanisms, they operate, you know, all across China, and they're an opportunity, Scott and others, to embed these other dimensions, I think. And the aim globally, getting back to that, is really to learn from what's going on in China and some of the other countries that are far ahead in this, most especially also in Latin America, a handful of countries there, and to begin scaling these approaches and testing at much more system-wide levels. So thank you for the conversation along the way and for your patience with the Zoom. And I really hope to follow up and get to know the new people among you, for me, better, and work more with all of the friends I see on the Zoom. Thank you.
Great. So any questions?
I have a very quick question. So you say you haven't been involved in, you know, during the pandemic. We understand that a lot, but how did 2019 compare, your interactions and collaborations compare with 2015? That's the last time I went to a conference with you in Xi'an Jiaotong University. But have you seen a decline of interest in collaboration, or, you know, has it maintained or even improved? And obviously what we're looking for is, you know, ways where we can, you know, where there can be productive collaborations that help China, the US, and the world, right?
Okay, yeah, I would say things have just been taking off in terms of intensifying collaboration. So at these meetings, we've had delegations of, it started with a handful of people from China, and now we just get like huge sets of people from major institutions, research and policy institutions across the country, and we have live translation. And we had planned a major thing at last year's Symposium 2020 that we unfortunately had to cancel at the last minute. But this is from, I think, 2018. This is Mr. Ma Qian, who is heading the NDRC's Department of Development Planning, and which covers almost everything besides the military. And then he's now running the Yangtze River Economic Belt. And yeah, we're involved in all of those programs. The Yellow River Economic, it's not called a belt, but like a zone. I can't remember what it's called in English. But these major investments that in the scale of the huge river basins. And yeah, I would say the opportunity keeps growing. Like this photo on the upper left is a reminder just to say they came for a 2-week visit. And we had them here at Stanford for intensive workshops kind of around the clock. And then we visited other parts of the US to see kind of how some problems are being tackled or not in the US context. And a lot of it had to do actually with like protected areas and even with our conservation reserve program, which is somewhat analogous to the sloping land conversion program in China, set up, right after a major disaster of the Dust Bowl, and in China after major drought and then extreme flooding, and involving kind of similar public sector investment. But and there's a lot of interest in bringing in more private sector investment. That's one of the key frontiers, is sort of how to blend finance and de-risk private sector investment in the transformation that they want to see in development approaches across sectors. So I'm mainly showing you land and agriculture, but a lot of this is in hydropower and clean energy generally, and in like transportation, where transportation is and what the modes of transportation are, and other major sectors.
Yeah, this may be an unfair question because it sort of stretches a bit into the politics beyond your immediate research, but it's relevant, I believe. There's been increasing amount of China bashing coming from the US, certainly under the Trump administration, but even Biden seems recently to be declaring that he's going to be, quote unquote, tough on China. I wonder does that seem to be influencing? It's kind of subjective of you, it would have to be subjective, but in terms of either the ability for you to be involved with the Chinese institutions and decision makers, or does it also have any influence on the freedom with which you can come up with results? Are there restrictions on how you display the results from your research? Do you notice any patterns here?
So this has been a major worry for sure, but I would say up till now, we've been very welcomed, and our work is, it's harder over Zoom, which is how we meet, or other platforms, but it's really intensifying in great ways so far. I'm always worried that at any moment it could all, be, things could change for multiple reasons, including the specific and a really crucial one you're mentioning, Larry. But to give an example of some of how the work is continuing, I'll just mention the platform. Everything hinges on this platform, and I mainly fund the platform, and it's very challenging to get financial support to develop the platform. We've had it from a few foundations here, the Moore Foundation and such, but up till now, it's been millions of dollars of investment, and it supports a lot of this implementation worldwide. I'm trying to shift the model of support. But the reason I bring it up is that we've been a drag on supporting the tuning of the platform to cities. And China's opportunity to work across cities is now, and that's thought to be just fundamental from many angles, like just a cultural one. Having people understand, values of nature, people in urban settings is thought to be crucial just for support of policies that protect faraway places as well as nearby ones. So anyway, China has taken off with part of the platform themselves that they can fund, focused on cities and taking a somewhat different approach using AI and the massive data streams that they're getting to look, very empirically and in a different way, not really using a production function approach where we have all this empirical science for each little box and arrow on that chain of causation relating ecosystem condition to benefits to people. And then what we're doing is developing the platform for cities together, and we're going to compare the AI approach and deploy it here with this other approach that we've long had in development. And all of that's going really well. We have a lot of meetings always and stuff, but it's usually I go, so that's the short of it. It seems to be going really well. It's just hard over these types of meetings and with the time difference. And, there's so much more that happens in person that can't happen electronically. But I'm hopeful. There are many countries in the world that look to China and have looked more to China, especially during the Trump years, than to the US. And so China's actually really helped bring credibility globally to the approach and gotten enthusiastic participation from leaders in many institutions among the major development banks as well as countries and stuff. So I think overall it's been working pretty well given all the geopolitical realities, but I worry that it's a fragile, precarious situation too.
Okay, so I don't want to hold you for lunchtime. And let's give Gretchen a round of applause for her fantastic talk. I'm always amazed by how many collaborators you have and how influential you are around the world. Okay, Heather, it's all yours.
Fantastic, Gretchen. You are the model that our Sky wants to follow in terms of collaboration and policy impact. It was fabulous talk. Thank you.
You're so nice to say that, and I feel there's such a huge frontier for us to engage in together, and so I'm very grateful for the moment, and I say congratulations again to you for lifting the Sky, and I hope we can be one little pillar helping to hold it up together.
Top of the sky.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gretchen.